After all of the big buildings in the ashram, except for one, had been constructed, Annamalai Swami said, I was in Bhagavan's bathroom with one other attendant, and the other attendant, out of curiosity, said, Bhagavan, these sadhus who smoke ganja, that's cannabis, they seem to get very blissful. What is the relationship between the bliss that the sadhus experience from smoking ganja and the bliss that comes from spiritual practice? So instead of giving a direct answer, Bhagavan imitated a stone sadhu. He goes, Ananda, Ananda, Ananda being the word for bliss. So he put on a performance of being a completely stone sadhu, staggering around his bathroom until he got in front of Annamalai Swami, at which point his outstretched arms reached round Annamalai Swami and he gave him a hug, and Annamalai Swami said, instantly I went into samadhi. I completely lost my body consciousness, there was no awareness of the world. I was completely rooted to the spot. At some point later that morning, I became aware of my body, the world, the surroundings. Bhagavan had gone, the other attendant had gone. And he said there was something climactic about this particular experience. He knew that although he had spent 10 years working every day for Bhagavan, under Bhagavan's supervision, he knew that particular chapter of his life had come to an end. He realized that from that moment on, he was going to sit and meditate in Palakottu and try and put Bhagavan's teachings into practice. He knew, of course, that to do this he had to go and see Bhagavan, explain what he wanted to do and get his approval, but somehow inside he knew that this was the next phase of his life. So he found Bhagavan, explained what had happened, and he said, I want to go and meditate in Palakottu, may I have your permission? Bhagavan knew, I think, this was coming. I think he gave him the experience in order to push him off in that direction. Bhagavan was very happy with this. He said, yes, you go and meditate. So when Annamalai Swami got up that morning, he was a full-time, more than full-time. He had a job and a half working for Ramana Ashram, looking after all their building work. And just in the space of half an hour, all that finished. He took his keys to the ashram manager, Chinnaswami, said, I'm resigning, here are all my keys, I'm off to Palakottu. Everyone was completely astounded because he'd never discussed this. This was just something precipitated by this direct experience in the bathroom. Everyone, of course, said, but how are you going to support yourself? This was a man who had no money, no sponsors, no means of supporting himself. He just said, I don't know, not my business. I'm going to Palakottu, that decision has been taken, Bhagavan has approved, I'm leaving. So he started walking to Palakottu. He didn't have a job, he didn't have any money, he didn't have anywhere to stay that night. And as he was walking, he bumped into Managala Venkatramaya. We've already discussed him outside. He was the person who compiled talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. He had a hut here. So he told Managala, I've just decided to leave the ashram, I'm going to live in Palakottu. Managala said, oh, that's great. I've been called back to Bombay on urgent business. Here's the key to my house. You can go and stay in my house till I come back. So that solved his immediate problems. Then one of his close friends in the ashram, Major Chadwick, heard that he'd moved to Palakottu, that he didn't have any means to support himself. So he arranged for someone to come every day, cook lunch for Annamalai Swami. So just a combination of circumstances. He got the experience from Bhagavan in the morning. An hour later, he'd handed in his own keys. He'd collected his key to this hut in Palakottu. And by lunchtime, one of his oldest friends in the ashram had arranged for him to be fed. So this situation continued for a while. And then Annamalai Swami was standing, probably quite close to where I'm sitting right now, with a devotee who he had used to build some of the ashram buildings, called Arumagam. So they weren't talking about building Annamalai Swami a house, they were just standing having a casual chat, more or less where I'm right now. Bhagavan came by on his morning walk to Palakottu, saw Annamalai Swami, who was the ashram builder, talking to Arumagam, who was the one of the main masons. And I think possibly in a joking way, he said to Arumugam, "Oh, are you going to build Annamalai Swami a house?" Which of course he wasn't planning to do. And Arumugam said, it was as if I had no choice or decision over what I said. He said, "Yes, I'm going to build Annamalai Swami a house." And Annamalai Swami looked at him and thought, "Well, that's news to me." And then Bhagavan said, "Oh, make sure you build him a good one, build him a nice big house." So suddenly Arumugam felt compelled to carry out his obligation that Bhagavan had come. He'd made this promise in front of Bhagavan he was going to build a house, and he didn't have any money, Annamalai Swami didn't have any money. What they had was Bhagavan suggesting that a house be built, and Arumugam, for no reason whatsoever, blurting out, "Yes, I will build a house." So when things like this happen, when Bhagavan has pushed events in a particular way, they always have a habit of working out. But here is a man who didn't talk from book knowledge. He didn't talk from information he'd got from anything else except what Bhagavan had told him and what he discovered himself through his own spiritual practice. So to come and see him was to get, in a way, is to get very raw, uncompromising teachings directly from the source. What I liked about him, he was very shy and withdrawn. I just want to demonstrate how Annamalai Swami was when you came to see him. He would sit on his sofa, and there was something physically closed about him. He'd be a little bit hunched up, and then he wouldn't be looking at you. And then you'd say, "Swami, how do I do self-inquiry?" And he'd start blah, 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 blah. He'd start muttering. And if he liked what you were saying, if he thought you were asking interesting questions, useful questions, and that you were listening to his answers, like his head would slowly come up. And it was like a flower opening. The more he realized that you appreciated what he had to say, the louder his voice would get, the more animated he would get. He would expand. His whole body would open up. His smile would come on his face, and by 10 or 15 minutes into the conversation, if you were on his wavelength, if you were talking about sadhana, Bhagavan, practice, the only thing that really appealed to him anyway, these were the topics he wanted to talk about, then he'd be full on. He'd be totally animated, totally talkative, and you had a great time with him. But somehow if you weren't talking about things that interested him, he'd kind of stay in this little kind of hunched up mode. And this was interesting because there was an old devotee of Bhagavan called G.V. Subramaya, and he wrote an account of how Ramana Maharshi, to some extent, was the same. He said Bhagavan would sit on his sofa, and he said it was a skilled art getting an answer from Bhagavan. You had to be very brief, you had to be to the point, you didn't need to ramble, and most of all, don't interrupt when he started speaking. So he said people would come, and if they knew the technique, they would address a question to Bhagavan. And Bhagavan might look initially as if he hadn't noticed you, listened to you, had no intention of replying to you. But G.V. Subramaya said, don't be tempted to repeat your question or prompt him. He said, just sit there, be quiet. He's listened to you, he's heard you. There's some response is kind of bubbling up. And he said, then Bhagavan would start talking. He would be quiet, he'd be slow, possibly a little hesitant. And if he could see that you were interested and that no one was interrupting him, his speed would increase, he would get more and more animated. If he was telling stories about the gods or the saints, he'd start acting out the part of all the people in the stories. And he said the one thing you absolutely never could do was say, but Bhagavan, what about this? Or, this doesn't make sense. And then he'd go back into his shell again. So it was a question of giving one simple question that would trigger a response, waiting for the question to sink in, and then Bhagavan would suddenly bloom. He'd get into this incredibly animated mode. And what G.V. Subramaya said was that you have to understand that Bhagavan wasn't talking from a mind to a mind. When you asked these very short, terse questions, you were somehow triggering the self. You were triggering Brahman to give a response. And if you could sit quietly, you could sit patiently, then God himself, then Brahman himself would get more and more voluble, and you'd get this exceptional answer. And he said the trick was, don't interrupt. Don't assume he hasn't heard. Just sit there and wait for the whole unfolding process to happen. And I saw that to some extent with Annamalai Swami. He would start in this little like a little hunched up old man sitting on a bench, and if somehow he felt you were talking about the things that he cared about, slowly, everything would open up and you'd have a great conversation with him.
I can't find the start of me without seeing the start of you. And I know things have to change, but I find it strange, and I know you do. And I've been going in circles all of these nights, trying to find a way back home. I started picking up pieces, hoping they make a picture that I know. And our time has come, and we keep it going on and on. Yeah, we count the clocks ticking just to slow the time. And we grow, and the seasons know there's a quiet that shows in the space between. And our fire no longer bright, is out of sight, and we both know. And I've been going in circles all of these nights, trying to find a way back home. I started picking up pieces, hoping they make a picture that I know. Our time has come, and we keep it going on and on. Yeah, we count the clocks ticking just to slow the time. And I've been going in circles all of these nights, trying to find a way back home. I started picking up pieces, hoping they make a picture that I know. And our time has come, and we keep it going on and on. Yeah, we count the clocks ticking just to slow the time.
head and threw his arms around my neck. Show me how you do it, and I promise that I'll run